chapter 3, the latter part of that chapter starts with some of the excuses that Moses offered to God, and it spills over into chapter 4. And so rather than look at half of those excuses this week and the next half next week, I just chose to look at the first part of Exodus chapter 3 here, and then Lord willing next week we're going to look at the excuses that Moses offered to God. And I also made mention in our studies this morning that we're going to look at a sermon that is entitled tonight, Lessons from the Burning Bush. And I thought it was kind of interesting to look at some of the facts around the surrounding bush, or some of, maybe I should say, the speculation around the burning bush itself. And what experts tell us is that burning bush that was most common in that day, or bush that was most common in that day and age of Moses and area, would have been much to us what we would have just considered a shaggy thorn bush. It is also interesting to note that it probably wouldn't have been as uncommon as we might think for one to have been on fire. In fact, many people have pointed out that people who lived in that area had seen more than one over their lifetime. Sometimes it might be from a traveling nomad whose fire was left behind. Of course, we have to remember it was a desert. It wasn't like there were green things all around. Most was dry. Also, lightning that would come through from time to time would strike these bushes and light them on fire. And so it might be the case that Moses had seen a burning bush before. We do know as we study this story, there are some characteristics, though, of this bush that stand out to Moses and makes him come over to investigate. There's always been a lot of questions around the symbolism of the burning bush. What exactly did that represent? And some people will trace it back to the likeness of God's nation of Israel, how they were going through the fiery trials and persecution of Egypt, but they weren't consumed. They came out of not being burned up by them. Other people will liken it to God himself. And it is interesting to note that fire is not an uncommon emblem whenever we're talking about representation of deity. In fact, there are numerous times throughout the Bible that God is surrounded by fire, or God is represented by fire in some way. So some people have said, well, the burning bush symbolizes the presence of God, and the fact that it burned but was not consumed symbolizes the idea that God is eternal in nature. You also have another interesting event surrounding the burning bush itself, or involving the burning bush, and that is the angel of the Lord speaks to Moses from this burning bush. It seems most proper and appropriate to me, as we study the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, to say that this is a visible manifestation of God in the flesh, probably the second person of the Godhead, as Jesus Christ. Those manifestations of God throughout the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, they're known by a real fancy word. You probably have heard it before, but it's the word theophanies. And that's the idea. You want to sound smart in a religious discussion, don't stumble over it like I did, but throw it around in front of your preacher or something. But it's a real fancy word, but it really just means an appearance of God. And a lot of times in the Old Testament, you'll have these situations where God appears. It's interesting to note that a lot of times these appearances of God are manifested in natural phenomena. It would be things like fire. He appeared to Elijah in an earthquake. We studied the book of Job where God appears to him in a whirlwind. He appeared to Israel in a cloud. There are also times in the Bible where God makes an appearance in the form of flesh. The book of Isaiah, the book of Ezekiel, and many other places where you can read about those. I thought it interesting to point out also that never when God makes an appearance does he ever come as an animal. That's kind of interesting to me. But all these things point to the idea that God made an appearance to man from time to time. When you get over in the New Testament, you don't have those. And part of the reason that you don't have those is because you have the ultimate appearance of God when Jesus comes down upon this earth and lives as a human being in the flesh. Now, we think about all those things. Those are ideas and speculations and discussions surrounding the burning bush itself. And however we choose to interpret that representation of the burning bush, I think the important thing for us to keep in mind is this: God did appear to Moses in that bush. And Moses spoke to God, and God spoke to Moses. And tonight what I want us to think about is some of these lessons that we can learn from this burning bush. The first thing that I want for us to keep in mind as we go through this first part of Exodus chapter 3 is to look for opportunities in the ordinary. We talked a little bit about it, or I talked a little bit about it this morning, in the involvement of Moses as to exactly what he was doing whenever he witnessed this burning bush. If you look in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 3, it says, "Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb." I pointed out, there's really, you think about Moses looking at his life, there was nothing exciting that was going on in the life of Moses at this time. There was nothing that was what would have been considered out of the ordinary for that day and age. Moses is just going about his everyday routine and his everyday work whenever God makes an appearance to him. Now, I want to remind you that Moses' situation, it was unique in that there were several things that had happened in his life. He had killed an Egyptian. I don't think everybody could say, "Yeah, I did that during my lifetime." That would have been something that was unique in the life of Moses. He also had tried to help his fellow Israelites. They had rejected him. And so that had led him, the killing of that Egyptian and rejection of his nation led him to where he was living in Midian, where now he had been a shepherd for about the space of 40 years. Life as a shepherd, I imagine, for Moses had probably become pretty routine. He's leading a flock. Now, understand, he's just doing what a shepherd does, what he does every day as a shepherd. He is leading a flock, and then it's then and there that God makes this appearance to him. In verse 2, it says, "The angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush." I was thinking about this setting, and I almost wanted to say in this dull setting, but I don't know that it was dull to Moses, and it might come as an insult to shepherds that everyday shepherding is dull. I will say this: it was in this ordinary setting that God made his appearance to Moses. Now, I want you to think about the lifetime of Moses. There were some pretty exciting and glamorous times in the life of Moses. Most of them probably took place in his earlier years, at least those in Egypt. There'd be some amazing things that happened later on in his life. But think about some of the best times that he had enjoyed in his life. Probably some of the most glamorous and some of the most important and significant times in his life thus far had been when he was considered the grandson of Pharaoh. And so there would have been a lot of pomp and glitz surrounding him. And a lot of times I think when we think about God, coming to us and an opportunity of God presenting itself to us, we think of it in that setting. We think of it probably as being something glitzy or something glamorous, but what I want for us to think about tonight is this idea that many times the opportunity to serve God is presented to us in what we would consider ordinary circumstances. We might even describe them as boring because they're just everyday occurrences within our life. Well, that was Moses. He was out here being a shepherd. He was out here doing what shepherds do, leading sheep, whenever God makes this appearance to him, and there's an opportunity that is presented before him. The lesson for us is simple. It's be faithful to God wherever you are. Now again, I think sometimes when we think about the opportunity to serve God, we might think of, well, I could fly overseas and I can go on this mission trip, and I can walk all these places and teach all these people. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great and that's fine and that's work that needs to be done. And that is an opportunity to serve God. But what I want us to think about is we have an opportunity to serve God each and every day of our life. We have opportunities in our ordinary, boring day lives to do service for God. And so we have the opportunity to study God's Word every day. We have the opportunity to pray to God. We have the opportunity to talk to other people about Jesus Christ. We have the opportunity to help those who are in need in every ordinary day of our lives. We might consider those opportunities boring, though, because they're not glitzy and glamorous. But it's during that time, and it's during that place, that ordinary course of life, that God makes an appearance to Moses and presents an opportunity before him. I would say that's probably where and when the least we expect to meet God and to meet with opportunity is in our ordinary day lives. And so I would just remind us to be faithful wherever we are in our lives, because God, the opportunity to serve God isn't always this silver platter and again, fireworks and things like that. It's just the ordinary things that we experience in our lives. The second thing that I want for you to think about, a lesson from the burning bush, is God needs our attention before he speaks to us. That probably sounds pretty obvious, and it is, but think about that concept. I thought about the idea of parents speaking to their children. And if you really want to get through to your child, you got to make sure your child is paying attention, right? Because there's sometimes you can talk to them and they're, are you listening? Yeah, I'm listening, but they're not really paying attention. And the same can be true with us when it comes to God speaking to us. Are we paying attention? Does he have our undivided focus whenever he says something to us? That's what he needed from Moses. If you look at the middle part of verse 2, it says, Moses looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Picture in your mind, once again, we talked about it this morning, Moses is walking this familiar path. It's probably a path that he's walked hundreds of times before in his 40 years of being a shepherd there in Midian. He lifts up his eyes, and he sees a bush that is on fire. Now, I pointed out this morning, but I want to re-emphasize it again tonight. Moses doesn't immediately run over to this bush, and that's kind of strange to me, because, and that may be some indication that he'd seen this sight before. The Bible says he was just watching that bush, and he was waiting for it to burn up. Maybe he's worried about fire getting out or something like that, but it wasn't until he noticed something strange about this bush that he actually went over to investigate. And of course, the strangeness is recorded for us in verse 3. Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Well, it was on fire, but it wasn't burnt. It was on fire, but it was not consumed. And so Moses goes to investigate whenever he sees that this is no ordinary burning bush. This is a bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. It's then that God has the full undivided attention of Moses. And if you notice in verse 4, it makes that statement. It says, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush. It wasn't until Moses turned aside. It wasn't until Moses went out of his ordinary path and he actually went to investigate that God speaks to Moses. And so God gets Moses' attention through the means of this burning bush. It's only when Moses turns aside, when Moses goes to see the bush up close and personal, that God speaks to him. The reason why is now God has Moses' full attention. What I want us to think about tonight is God he used the means of the burning bush to get Moses' full attention. And there are different methods that God uses to get our full attention too. Now, some of these methods we probably don't care for them too much, but nonetheless, they do often turn our full undivided attention to God. I thought about three things, and I just want to mention them briefly. There's many other methods that we probably could and should look at. But one of the first things that came to my mind was the birth of a child. There are many times, I've seen it over the years through the Lord's church, when you've worked with people and with young couples and you're trying, who have fallen away from the church and you're trying to get them back. And sometimes when they have a child, it's like somebody flips a switch. All of a sudden now they're at church all the time. Now all of a sudden they're interested and they're bringing their children. I think the reason why is when you become a parent, you realize the great responsibility that you have. The responsibility to raise these children right and to do the right thing. And so because of that, we now turn our full undivided attention to God. I also wrote down good fortune. I thought about this a little while too. all of us have good fortune, whether we really recognize it or not. You know, we're blessed to live in the country that we live in. We're blessed to experience and to enjoy many of the luxuries of life. What is our response to those good things of life? What is our response to the good fortune that God has given to us? Well, it can have one of two effects. The effect that it should have is not that we feel full and that we don't need anyone or anything else, but it should create a sense of unworthiness and gratefulness and create a response to God within our lives. That a lot of times you can look at those blessings and you can say, man, you know, those are things that God has just poured out upon us abundantly, and we don't deserve even one of them. And that causes us to pay attention to God. The third one is a little bit more difficult, and unfortunately it's probably the one that it takes to get most people's attention, and that is tragedy. God, we know this, we studied the book of Job thoroughly. God doesn't create the tragedies within our lives, but He does use those tragedies to get our attention. And so we have to understand that God is always looking to speak to us through His Word. He's looking for us to pay attention to Him. Sometimes things have to happen in our life before He gets our full undivided attention. Our goal tonight, or our goal in this study, is not, I'm not saying look for a burning bush like Moses, but there are those symbolic burning bushes in our life. There are those things in our life that often cause us to pay attention to God, to give Him our full undivided attention. Look for those things within our life and understand that God can use those things to make us pay attention to Him. But God does need our attention before He speaks. Listen, He can talk to us all He wants, but until we pay attention, it's not going to do Him any good. The third thing that I want to talk about tonight is we need to understand when we're in the presence of God, we better take off our shoes. That's exactly what God tells Moses in Exodus 3 and verse 5. He said, "Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." When God told Moses to take off his shoes, He was teaching a lesson to him that needs to be taught to every person. And that is the idea of the holiness of God. I know holy is one of those religious words. We throw it around a lot. We read it in the Bible a lot. I often say, and it's the best definition for me in my mind, it may not be for you, but think of it in the idea or the word different. And when you're talking about God and holiness, think about it in this way, entirely different. It's like nothing and no one else. And that's God. God is holy. He's nothing like us. When we think about morality, when we think about justice, when we think about righteousness, God is nothing like us. He's way above us. When we think about God being an eternal being and we being mortal beings, God is nothing like us. He is holy. He is distinct. He is entirely different from us. And so we need to understand that when we're in the presence of God, there needs to be a level of respect and reverence that is due to no other being. We need to be submissive whenever God asks or tells us to do something. And that was the lesson that He was trying to teach to Moses. You're not coming before any ordinary being. You're coming before someone like nobody else, somebody who is entirely different. Think about the song that Moses and Israel would sing after they come up out of the land of Egypt in Exodus chapter 15. In verse 11, that song entails some of the characteristics of God, but this was one of those lines from this song. It says, "Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, and doing wonders?" God is like no one and nothing else. And when we think about God, there should be a level that is reserved in our mind for God and His being that's separate from everyone and everything else. Think about, for instance, the idea of when we talk about God and His holiness, the idea that God is like nobody else. Well, how do we think of God? Some people think of God like, well, you know, God's my chummy friend here. I'm going to put my arm on His shoulder and we're going to walk together side by side. That's not the way we should think about God. Some people, when they think about God as kind of their own personal Santa Claus. You know, God's going to give you everything you need and everything you want to for Christmas, right? That's Santa Claus, and that's God in their minds. Some people think of God as kind of the loving grandparent, and I don't want to insult grandparents tonight, but you know how most grandparents are. Those of us who have their grandchildren know. It's basically, you can behave any way you want, and whenever you ask, I'll give you whatever you ask for, right? That's the idea and the mindset. Well, that's how some people think God is. You know, God is this being, you can just live your life however you want to do it, live it, and whenever you ask for something, God's going to give it to you. That's not the picture of God that the Bible paints for us. The picture of God is entirely different from everyone and everything else. And there should be a tremendous level of respect and admiration and reverence and submission for God that we reserve for no one else. It is interesting to point out that in the Old Testament, you have God calling Moses to a mountaintop. And when God calls Moses to the top of Mount Sinai, he makes one of the most remarkable promises in the Bible. It's recorded in Exodus chapter 29. I'm not going to read all of it, but I do just want to read the heart of it. In verse 43 of Exodus 29, God says this to Moses. He says, "There I will meet with the children of Israel, and the tabernacle shall be sanctified by my glory." In verse 45, he says, "And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will be their God." You ever stop to think about that? God had this promise, made this promise to the nation of Israel, that I will live among you, that I will dwell in the midst of you. The God of the entire universe, the God of all majesty, promises to dwell among his people. What did that demand from these people? It demanded a level of holiness, didn't it? It demanded that they be different from everybody else, because God is different from everybody and everything else. When you go over in the New Testament in John chapter 1 and verse 14, we read about Jesus, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among men. I probably pointed this out before. Well, I know I have, but that word dwelt, at least as it's translated into English, it literally means that God pitched his tent with men. In other words, God came down to dwell with men. God came down to live in the middle of men. And what does that exactly mean? Well, when God pitched his tent in the middle of us, that means that he was present with us. That means that he identified with us as human beings. And what we understand from the New Testament, God made this promise to his people in the Old Testament, but we also have this promise in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verses 16 and 17, Paul says this as he's writing to the church, and I want to emphasize that word to you, to the church as a whole, when he's writing this letter. He says, "Know ye not," and I pointed out before that pronoun, whenever you find it in the King James Version, ye, what you know about that is that's the second person plural. That means you all. That's how we would say it. He's not talking to one person. He's talking to everybody. Who's he talking to? The church. And he says, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? And if any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are." You know, you think about this idea in the Old Testament. You had this tabernacle. You had this place where God dwelt among men. God would literally be in the middle of them. And so in the New Testament, you have this imagery of the temple of God today. What is the temple of God today? It's the church. It's the place where God dwells among his people. It's the place where we can come into close contact with God. And so just like in the Old Testament, what did that demand of the people? It demanded a level of holiness, didn't it? It demanded that they be different from everyone and everything else. And so today we have this great promise, just like they had in the Old Testament, that God is present with us, the church, wherever we are. Remember Jesus' words in Matthew 18 and verse 20? He said, "Where 2 or 3 of you are gathered together, there am I in the middle of you." You have this idea of the church being the dwelling place of God, the place where God comes down and pitches his tent among men. Does God demand something of it in exchange for that? Yes, holiness. He demands that we be different from everybody else because He is different from everything and everybody else. That concept spills over into what we do with our bodies, how we conduct ourselves here upon this earth, the words that we use. All of those things should reflect in our lives the holiness of God. Wherever God is present, though, what do we know? You got to take off your shoes, don't you? You got to treat God reverently. You have to treat Him with submission. And you have to be holy because God is holy. So we looked at three things tonight. First of all, God often appears in the ordinary. We need to look for opportunities in the ordinary, everyday course of life, because many times there's opportunities that God presents to us that escape us. God needs our attention before He speaks to us. You know, we need to understand there are things that can happen in our life that can cause us to be more attentive to God than our normal everyday of action. We need to recognize those things in our life whenever they're present, and we need to give God our full undivided attention. It just happens literally in the life of Moses. It was a burning bush. The third thing that we talked about was the idea that wherever God's presence is, the ground that He stands upon is always going to be holy, so we better take off our shoes. That means if God dwells in the midst of His people, He dwells within the church, we better be holy people. We better be different people, because that demands holiness. Wherever God is, that's what He demands that place to be. So I guess the great lesson for us is, again, don't look for a literal burning bush in your life, but we do have those symbolic burning bushes from time to time. We have those things that are opportunities for us to do something for God. We have those things where that happen in our lives where it really gets our attention. We have those places and those things that we should do that should reflect the holiness of God in our life. There's tremendous lessons that we can learn from the burning bush. Maybe there's one here tonight, though, who's never